Lecture 4, Milton's Avenge, O Lord, Poetry, Religion, and the Rationality of Experience.
Ladies and gentlemen, the occasion of the poem which I am now going to present to you, Milton's sonnet on the Lake Massacre in Piedmont, unlike the occasion of the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, and as I was reminded, unlike the occasion of Shakespeare's Phoenix and the Turtle, is known. John Milton was the Foreign Secretary of Robert Cromwell. Cromwell governed the Puritan establishment in England, which had obtained power in 1640 by killing the king, Charles I, an act which subverted the very basis of social and symbolic order by which the Western world obtained its rationality, as Sir Patrick Spens' ballad so forcibly reminds us, kingship being a power on earth linked to the power of God over creation. Milton read in the international newspapers for May and June 1655 of the massacre of the Waldensians, or the Vaudois, by the Catholic soldiers of the Duke of Savoy on April 25th of that year. In Milton's day, the Protestants, of whom Milton was one, thought of those persons, the Waldensians, as an ancient sect dating back even to the time of the Christian apostles. A sect, therefore, which preserved the original Christianity that reformers such as English Protestants, in the name of whose faith Cromwell had killed a king, sought by their return to Scripture and removal of current abuses to restore. Even more fundamentally, we may say that the newspapers and newsletters, themselves a form of communication new in the mid-19th century, which makes it possible for Milton to write a poem entitled The Late Massacre, the late news of the massacre which I have heard about more rapidly and I'm more close to as information than I could ever have been without newspapers, had brought Milton out of the great unknown of the history of which he was part and to which he was sacramentally, politically, and rationally obligated, news of the unjustly afflicted suffering of persons who were part of the body of his religious community. As the bodies of the Waldensians were mutilated, whose bones lie scattered, so also was the body of which Milton was, as they were, literally a member. Milton's body, the body of his church, the body of his God, in whose image all bodies were made human in the first creation, in the image of God. As St. Paul said, and as the Protestants deeply remembered, we are members of one another, Ephesians, and members of Christ, 1 Corinthians. What the newsletters had brought Milton, as the newspapers have and do bring to us day after day, was a narrative about the history of which he was part, which contradicted the narrative he knew and believed. What the newsletters had brought Milton was a narrative about the history of which he was part, which contradicted the narrative which he knew and believed, contradicted the narrative of God's effective care for the human image, Bible, contradicted the narrative of the nation's effective care of the human image, contradicted the narrative of his own effective care for the human image as public servant. At the moment before the speaker in the sonnet on the late massacre in Piedmont begins speaking, the speaker has suffered the realization that all the grids and matrices, all the narratives and findings which constitute the deep intelligibility of the world and construct a narrative in which it is possible to think and love are contradicted by another incontrovertible narrative, the story that history is telling about itself. At that moment, the speaker is thrown back upon this discourse I am presenting to you of, in effect, last resort. The discourse of poetry, prior, as we have said, to religion, in order, as in the phoenix and the turtle, that the poet may refound the rationality of the world by announcing, as poetry does, the speech of the person in search of the ground or authority by which that speech can once again be made value-bearing. The body has been torn, about which the story is that it must be and is divinely intended to be whole. The great abstract image of the person, the body, must be remembered. For that reason, our sonnet begins with an imperative, the grammatical form by which our language makes actual the will to construct the world. Remember those build imperatives, build it up. The command imperative, let the bird of loudest lay, all grammatically organized, as is the great economic imperative, the cry for compensation or the restoration of fair exchange upon which our understanding of moral life is based. Avenge, where vengeance is the sign of the will toward rationality in terms of the wild redress of a loss which, because it cannot be reversed, must be compensated. Even when the children said, the bridge is not mended, but it does not matter, there is a sense, what is expected is a compensation. It does not matter because we have the game. What we shall see across time is a marked decay of the confidence in compensation for states of loss, which give rise to poems. In Milton's poem, we find ourselves at a crisis of uncompensated mind, in which a loss unanticipated by the moral universe, the amputation of a limb in effect of God, cannot be compensated even by the poem. The bridge, the body, is never reconstructed, and increasingly across time it begins to matter more and more in a way which drives poems into new and strange forms. Following the imperative, the vocative in the form of an apostrophe, O Lord. Now when we take the name of another into language of our own, as you might say, O Alan, and I am taken into your language, right? When we take the name of the other into language of our own sentence, as when in the social situation I call out your name. The grammatical move thus performed is called the vocative, and the rhetorical move, I remind you, is called apostrophe. Here, the speaker takes the name of the God into the sentence of the self for the purpose of restoring to the shattered narrative of history the name of the great protector of the human image. Poetry, prior to religion, is the resource of the human will toward the recovery of the rationality of the world. In other terms, it is in the poem that the speaker summons the God to remember his greatest creation, to be consistent with his own predicates. As in the case of the three poems we have already studied, this poem, sponsored by the speaker who says, Avenge, O Lord, this poem is driven into actuality, the speech of the person, by the collapse of a great civilizational machine which has suddenly ceased to provide the intelligibility of the world, the intactness of the human image, in the one case, the Waldensians, in which the human image could most justly claim the protection of the Lord. Cromwell named himself the protector. The broken mechanism is history as the story about justice. The justice of God, the state, and their dependent institutions, such as law, and even what we call science. To state the matter in another way, the greatest of all civilizational machines, greater even than love because assumed and postulated within love, is cosmos. C-O-S-M-O-S, cosmos. The ordered whole, or what we can call the rationality of the world, the meaning of things, that characteristic of reality which makes the world knowable and thereby establishes the common place where persons can meet one another by establishing a shared understanding of what is. Milton's sonnet begins, "Avenge, O Lord," and is situated at the moment of the breaking of that machine called cosmos, the order of the whole, which generates and regenerates the meaning of experience. One may say that the poetic text is the last ordered result of the decay of cosmos. In Nietzschean language, the last creative act of the dying God. Vengeance is the motive. Note, vengeance is the motive to restore the rationality of the world in the absence of any other means, which is to say, in the absence even of God. As a means of recovery, the poem is a heterocosmos, a second cosmos. Second, is a heterocosmos, a second cosmos, a last supplement, or perhaps even the vengeance of humanity enacted against divinity. When God's descriptions cease to make sense, the poet's descriptions become a second or counter description, a second or counter world, a heterocosmos directed against God as a vengeance for the failure of God's account of things which have been overtaken by the experience of history. Understood then in this way, poetry and history is seen ambivalently, either as the act of the restoration of divinity, as in a sense we will see it in Yeats, or could see it in Eliot, or as the final act of the extinction of God by the human community through the supply of God's works, the conservation of the human image by other means. In any case, in the poem before us, not the existence of the world, as in the Phoenix and the Turtle, which required the reproduction of the creating let there be light, let the bird of loudest lay. But the meaning of the world is created, as created, is at stake. Avenge, O Lord, summons God at the point of his absence, when the marks and tracings of his intelligence on experience have been erased by an atrocity which is not unimaginable merely, but which subverts the possibility of imagination altogether. God is appealed to in his absence, as I have said, by means of a rhetorical strategy we encountered in the voices of the children and called apostrophe, "London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady." Now I will read the poem to you. How hard it is to reconstruct the crisis of mind upon which this speaker is situated when he begins speaking. How hard it is to condense into the utterance of 140 syllables the contingency upon speaking of the rationality of all being. Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints, whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold, even them who kept thy truth so pure of old, when all our fathers worshipped stocks and stones. Forget not in thy book, record their groans who were thy sheep, and in their ancient fold, slain by the bloody Piedmontese that rolled mother with infant down the rocks. Their moans, the vales redoubled to the hills, and they to heaven, their martyred blood and ashes sow o'er all the Italian fields, where still doth sway the triple tyrant, that from these may grow 100-fold, who, having learnt thy way, early may fly the Babylonian woe. Now this poem, it is easy to see, is a sonnet, constructed as sonnets are, on a grid or abstract pattern consisting of a horizontal line from left to right composed of 10 positions, each as it happens occupied by a syllable that is spoken. Avenge 2, O Lord 4, thy slaught 6, saints 8, whose bones 10, right? That's the abstract pattern, identically repeated, identically present throughout all the lines of the poem. That's the horizontal line from left to right, composed of 10 positions, each occupied by a syllable in this case. The sonnet is also composed of a vertical line, made up of 14 of these horizontal lines. And that vertical line of lines is generally divided, as you know, into a segment of 8 lines and a second segment of 6. You will remember or have noted that the ratio of 8 and 6 describes the relation of horizontal lines, first a line of 8 and then of 6, in the ballad measure we have seen in Sir Patrick Spens, and that the sum of those lines also makes 14. Now, poetry honors the names of the making of and the makers of poems. For example, this sonnet of Milton. But it is one thing to have written a sonnet and another to have written the code by which all sonnets are composed. It's one thing to solve a problem by use of an operating system. It's another thing to write the operating system. Beneath every composition by a named author, there is a succession of anonymous makers of the ever deeper codes of composition. It is not enough to know how the sonnet is made, but to consider the ever deeper codes of composition closer to the great engine of construction to which sonnet structure gives access. Beneath the maker of this sonnet or any other is the maker of the sonnet system, which emerged in Italy, to which the rage of this poem is at the end carried back. The structure of a poem is not the work of its named author. The structure of a poem is not the work of its named author. The namelessness of the first maker of a structure signifies the cultural importance of the abstractness of deep structure in relation to natural language and natural persons, always engaged in ever making. As Whitman said, how are you so proud to write a poem? Consider the pride of the nameless maker who constructed the system which you merely put in play, right? Deep, deep inside every poetic act, there are ever deeper successions of nameless makers of ever more fundamental systems. The deep structure of a poem, in this case it's sonnet software or operating system, is powerful because it comes from outside the domain of named persons. Poetic structures are like buildings, or let us say theaters, in which persons can be seen, in which the speech of a person can become audible across time and across the difference between persons. The abstractness of structure constitutes its power for persons in the concrete world of natural language, to which abstract structure, nameless in its invention, supplies out of the generosity of its abstractness a home. All poetic structure is abstract and for that reason powerful. But I wish to call your attention to the fact that no structure has inherent meaning. Whenever we study an art, we must realize that structures are not inherently meaningful. The meanings of poetic structures, like the meanings of all structures whatsoever, are supplied in the history of the deployment of such structures in practice by association with particular uses, and especially by early prestigious use, which stain the structure with meanings present thereafter whenever that structure is present. Blank verse, by the time of Robert Frost, always meant only the line long enough to engage persons in social relations. 10 does not mean social relations, but after the enormous success of Elizabethan blank verse, deployed in dramatic situations, do you understand? The line of 10 became the line of dramatic exchange of persons in concrete social situations, and so we find it in Frost, so we find it in Edwin Arlington Robinson, and it was for that reason that Willie Yeats couldn't write blank verse, because he never met anybody in his life, and the social person was out of reach of any knowledge that he possessed. Structures have no inherent meanings, but the meanings of poetic structures are supplied in history by association with particular uses, and, to repeat myself, by early prestigious use especially, which stain the structure with meaning present thereafter whenever that structure is present. And the ballad system, 8 plus 6, always carries with it that knowledge greater than the knowledge of the king, that imperial present tense that we have studied in Sir Patrick Spens. The sonnet system, 14 times 10, always carries with it the initial sense by which the system was stained in its first use in Italy in the 14th century and in England in the 16th. And the first use of the sonnet system was as a theater of love.
This is the end of Side A. Please fast forward the cassette and turn it over to continue.